And at this point, I would like to, as she's unmuting her mic, introduce Ms. Amanda Bisong, who is a policy officer in the migration program at the European Center for Development Policy Management in the Netherlands. And her research focuses on regional migration governance in West Africa. She also researches on migration agreements between European and African countries, looking at labor migration in Africa, exploring the linkages between trade and migration in Africa, as well as looking at migration governance. And in the recent years, she has published several research articles on regional migration governance and previously worked on regional integration and trade facilitation in ECOWAS. So a very well-rounded policy officer joining us from ECDPM. Amanda Bisong, if I could just invite you to give us your insights.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's been a very interesting discussion. Can you hear me? It's been a very interesting discussion, and it's following the insights from different countries. It's been quite, yeah, very insightful. I think I'll just speak about the regional perspective, and I might repeat some of the things that have been said in some of the presentations, but I'll try as much as possible to avoid them, and then I might try to double into some of the questions that were asked earlier in the chat box. Yeah, Paddy, please feel free to give me a sign when I have 2 minutes left so I can start rounding up. I think if we look at the regional perspective, what I'll try to address is the direct and indirect socioeconomic implications for vulnerable members, for vulnerable migrant groups, looking at the regional perspective. I'd also look at how this affects change in labor mobility partnerships and other types of regulatory migratory shifts based on the questions I received, and also what will happen to irregular migrants. If we look at and I'll be speaking from the angle of regional economic communities, focusing more on ECOWAS in West Africa. Now, if we look at the response of the regional economic communities in Africa as a whole, what we see, we can categorize them basically into 4 different kinds of responses. So a first response has to do with information and communication. Here we have RECs, basically collecting information and sharing this verified information among member states. We also see a move towards nudging and guidance. So here we have RECs that are recommending different steps or measures that should be taken by different member states, or urging them to take these measures. And then we see also coordination. So here we have harmonized measures being taken by RECs and harmonized measures being taken by member states belonging to particular RECs. And also we see a collective action, which is more of pooling resources together, having joint structures, joint testing mechanisms, and this kind of links to what the first speaker was talking about when he responded in saying that we see the African Union now pulling procurement processes together at the AU level, being pushed or moved by the African CDC. Now, if we look at these 4 different types of responses that we see states are taking, then, and we look more clearly at West Africa, we see that the ECOWAS region, the countries in the ECOWAS region, ECOWAS as a regional organization has basically been undertaking more of a coordination and a collective action. So we're seeing harmonization of measures, and we're seeing pulling resources and using joint structures together in the region. If we come to the socioeconomic implications of COVID-19 on the region as a whole, we see that because of the lockdown measures, the strict lockdown measures that were imposed by all the member states of ECOWAS, we see cross-border trade halted, and cross-border trade is a very important part of livelihoods in West Africa, because you have lots of female migrants and also female cross-border traders that carry daily produce from border markets across different border markets in the region. And so this is a key source of livelihood, and this was affected because of the lockdown measures. What we saw initially was that you had some sort of bubbles created along bubbles created between cross-border communities. And so people from different border communities were allowed to trade. And in ECOWAS, the border community is identified by, I think, 8 kilometers after the border. Anyone living in these areas are able to move freely across the border areas. And so we saw trade happening in bubbles across these communities for a limited period. But as the lockdown measures intensified, these bubbles were also shut down, and you had complete shutdown of trade, and it affected the livelihoods of people living in these regions. What we also saw was that as even though we had this complete lockdown, you could see movement of food and movement of essential commodities like medication and personal protective equipment was allowed to go from one country to another in the region, which was quite commendable and quite good. But in a region where we do not have, where we have goods moving along with people, and not just, I mean, the logistic chains also involve the truck drivers and their mates moving with the trucks. This also meant that there was some sort of movement of persons in addition to the movement of essential goods. And so measures had to be taken by cross-border agencies such as customs, immigrations, to assist or facilitate the movement of these people, even though you had lockdown measures imposed. And this kept the supply chains running and kept food prices, although we saw inflation of food prices in some countries like Nigeria, but in general, food prices did not really go as high as was initially imagined, because we were able to manage the logistics and movements of food, medication, and personal protective equipment from one part of the region to the areas in the region where it was needed. Also, another thing we see when we look at the implications for livelihoods, we see that it also affected seasonal workers, cross-border traders, itinerant migrants, cross-border workers, because in some countries in the region, you have people living in one city and working in another city across borders. And so these people were really affected by this lockdown measures. We saw that student mobility was also affected, and migrant workers in general was also affected. And this is a region where we have 84% of the migrant workers working within the region also. So it meant that intra-regional movements were were severely affected. And of course, it's much worse for displaced persons in the region, because of course there's a high number of displaced people in the region due to conflicts in Nigeria, the Boko Haram conflicts in Nigeria, terrorist attacks also in Burkina Faso and in northern Ghana. And so we saw that a lot of displaced people found themselves even in more difficult positions, because the lockdowns within countries that prevented people from moving from one town to another also made it difficult for them to flee from this conflict. And of course, there were lockdown measures, but this did not mean that there was a pause in the number of conflicts that went on. So you saw people in a more difficult position trying to move within the hours where they are allowed to move when there are conflicts. Oh wow, just 2 minutes already. Okay. So another thing we saw was that it has an implication on remittances as a whole. World Bank has estimated that 23% of remittances, that there'll be a reduction in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole by 23%. But then in West Africa, you have lots of countries that are dependent on remittances. So for a country, for example, like Nigeria, remittances amounts to almost 7%, 7 times the development assistance, the official development assistance received. In countries like Gambia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Liberia, remittances account for more than 15 to 20% of the GDP. And so this severely will affect these countries, especially given the fact that we also see a reduction in commodity prices at the same time. So one of the effects of COVID-19 that we're seeing hugely, and even before we started seeing the health effects in Africa, we already felt the economic effects, and now it's eventually morphing into a financial crisis, and this will have huge implications for livelihoods in terms of the number of people that will slip into poverty. So it's estimated that about, I think it's about 20, no, it wasn't 20, it was about 40 or so million people that would slip into poverty in Africa just this year alone. And what does this mean now for a continent where most of the migration is based on economic migration? Will we see more or will we see less of this economic migration, especially because of the financial impacts of the crisis? Another area where we're seeing a lot of effects is on returnees, right? So if we take, for example, a country, return migration in general has been halted because there are no flights going into the region from countries outside the region. So we take example, a case of Niger, where you have returnees on an emergency transmission mechanism, and these returnees are now stuck there, and they cannot be resettled in other countries as previously promised. So putting a stress already on already pressurized local services. And then what we see when we come to irregular migration is that irregular migration is still ongoing in the middle of all this lockdown measures, and while we're seeing the difficulties of movement of people across borders, but irregular migration is ongoing. And from January to June, if we look at the migration between Africa and Europe, we see that there has been about 3,600 African migrants who arrived in Europe. What's happening is that migrants are taking more dangerous routes now because they also have to evade more border agency officials. And so this pushes them to take more dangerous routes. And we're seeing also an increase in the number of deaths because European countries are they're taking stringent measures, such as declaring their ports unsafe or pushbacks to Libya, or no rescue ships or no rescue missions available for migrants who are stuck on the Mediterranean. And then if we look at refugee applications, although refugees have refugee applications or refugee services in general have been considered as an essential service, we see that not because of the offices that were closed as a result of lockdown measures, refugee applications weren't able to be made, and so this has an effect on people or persons in general who were applying for these for a refugee status. If we look in general at ECOWAS, now we see that what ECOWAS is trying to do is have a harmonized approach towards easing the lockdown measures. And the focus of this harmonized approach is to also keep a balance with economic growth. So while we're easing the lockdown measures, we have public health issues in mind, and we're also focusing on economic growth. I think one thing that's important to remember is that this is a region that has already dealt with an epidemic like Ebola and somehow managed to find a way out of it. And on the basis of this, there are procedures, protocols, regulations, standard operating procedures on how to move towards a post COVID setting where the restrictions are lifted, and where economic growth would somehow still be the focus of these countries. And so you have different handbooks and different protocols that have been already established since 2019 by the West Africa Health Organization, who is responsible for coordinating the public health response from ECOWAS as a whole. Now, another interesting thing, and that's, I think I'll just drop this in as my final comment, because I research a lot more on the relationship between Europe and Africa. And if I look in Europe, and I see that the bulk of the migrants that have helped European countries to adjust or to maintain the stability in European countries during the lockdown measures in Europe, especially, have been low-skilled migrants. And when we see that in terms of regular or irregular, in terms of regular legal mobility schemes, we see that these target mostly high-skilled labor migrants from African countries. And so I think that there is a case to be made here for pushing for labor mobility labor mobility schemes that would also include low-skilled labor migrants from African countries to European countries, especially since we see that there is that gap that needs to be filled, and there is a potential for this. So I think I will summarize with that, and as a way forward, what we see the region doing now is moving towards releasing or moving towards easing these lockdown measures in a three-phased approach. So first of all, opening up the different countries, removing the restrictions within countries so that people can move from one town to another. And then the next step would be opening up the measures between countries in the region, so people can move from one country to another. And then we will see cross-border trade being restored. And lastly, moving to a point where there is people from outside the region are still allowed are now allowed to come back into the region.
Amanda, it's always insightful to have a conversation with you. And I think you just managed to unpack a lot of different issues there, taking us not just into West Africa, but, you know, rounding up some of African countries' important destinations. We looked at the Gulf, we looked at India, China, we've had the talk of it. And I think it was very important for us to get a European insight as well, as you were ending there. And I think indeed there is going to be vulnerabilities that will be that are advanced for migrants, and a lot that has to be done both from the African side in terms of pushing for labor mobility skills that are much more comprehensive, or actually represent the reality on the ground in terms of the migrants that are you know, that have intentions to migrate to move to Europe.